It's panel time. We're going to have fun right now, I think, because this is a little bit different than a number of things that we have typically done at this conference. We're going to talk about money and how to invest it properly and where to invest it. But the key thing here is something that we've seen at this conference. We've talked about the explosion in data and how that's just taking off, and the explosion in tools. Well, I think there's also an explosion in the number of companies that are getting into this space. And so we have three very experienced people in investing money in this space. And they cover different areas from, okay, we only do it from, right at the start, to other ones want to see more come out of it, to, well, okay, and I want to take this and that and mash it up to see what we can do. So without any more here, I'm not going to do a lot on introductions because you can see up here what we have. Yes, I'm the moderator. I'm Patrick Gossman. We have Adrian Fortino right down here from the Mercury Fund, Allison Malik from General Motors, which is kind of an interesting new position for her, and can't wait to hear a little bit about what that's about. And Saurabh Sharma, principal from Jump Capital. So what I'm going to ask each of them to do is to talk about a little bit about themselves and what they do, and then we'll get into some questions. And yes, I have some questions for them, but if you have questions, that's great, because we'll get to a point here. I'll get off the stage, I'm going to wander around with the microphone, and somebody's got a question, we'll let you ask, and maybe much more targeted than anything I come up with. So, shall we get started?
Sure. All right, thank you, Patrick. So hi, I'm Adrian. My background, I'm a mechanical engineer out of University of Michigan. Went and worked in the automotive world at a company called Ricardo, which some of you may know, for about 8 years, doing all kinds of fun advanced combustion electrification work in the early 2000s. Then got to a point that I was tired of working for a publicly traded British company and jumped into a startup in April of 2008. It's a particularly bad time to jump into a startup, but fun nonetheless. And I got the bug to be an entrepreneur. So I then went off and started three software companies. One I spun out of U of M called Shepherd IS, which was the first fleet management SaaS company, software as a service company, in 2009. Kind of moved some tech off of that to start a different company called Sidecar, which is the first instant rideshare company that I then moved to the Bay Area, and then we subsequently sold to GM a couple of years ago. And then also started a company called FlockTag, which has a presence here in Detroit, that is a digital loyalty system. So co-founder of those companies for several years, and then more recently have been doing investment work since 2013. Ran a fund called out of Invest Detroit here in town for a couple of years, and then for the past 2 years I've been the lead of the intelligent manufacturing investment practice at Mercury Fund. So I do, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but sort of think of it kind of advanced manufacturing and industrial internet investments. So we do investments in the middle of the country. So think Pittsburgh to Denver, and then Houston, which is where I have an office down there, up to Michigan, Wisconsin. I'm based here in Michigan. My office is over in Ann Arbor. And we do Series A investments. So that means that we're writing checks that are anywhere from $1 to $3 million within investment rounds that are anywhere from 3 to 5, sometimes a little bit higher. And we're looking for companies that are doing about $500,000 to $1 million in recurring revenue. And those are all B2B, business-to-business, SaaS, software as a service companies. And we'll talk about more of that a little bit later, but that's the short and sweet.
I'm Allison Malik. So about the time Adrian decided to enter the startup world, I had the genius idea of entering the automotive space, 2008, another great industry to go into. Luckily, I've been able to ride the wave. I graduated as a mechanical engineer, ended up hiring in to work as an electrical engineer. Got to work on the electrification products that GM was working on at the time, so the Chevy Bolt, and then the Chevy Spark EV, which is the predecessor to the Bolt that's now out on roads. Through those experiences, I was able to work pretty broadly, more broadly than they usually let engineers work. With charging, I was working with policy, marketing, and everything in between, and really learned what it takes to drive new technologies and new concepts through a giant industrial company. Leveraged that experience and moved over to GM's venture capital arm, where I worked as an investment manager. And with corporate venture capital, which is what I was doing, it's a little bit different than institutional. We come with some hooks and some help. Corporate venture, usually you're going to see that the venture capitalist wants to have a relationship with the company. So the last 2.5 years of my life were a lot of finding good companies and trying to help them find the right groups to work with within GM. In November of last year, I had the opportunity to transition into GM's new strategy organization. And instead of looking for ideas from the outside to come solve things inside, I'm now on the inside looking for things that need to get solved and seeing where we can solve them ourselves. For a lot of startups, that means they feel very sad because they think that I don't need them. In the data space, especially at GM with 12 million connected vehicles, we have a lot of data, and we have business needs that we need to solve, but that does not mean that we have or need to have the right ways to process the data. So we're still very interested in understanding, what types of companies are out there, and I'm still good friends with all of my friends in GM Ventures to help get deals done nonetheless.
All right, those are great backgrounds. Saurabh Sharma, I'm an engineer by training, grew up in India for the most part, did some part of my undergrad in computer science in India and then in France, and then worked as a researcher there for some time, went to Cornell to get my PhD, got brainwashed out of that, out of academia by Wall Street, and lived through Wall Street and Lehman Brothers till the end of the 2008, kind of culminating the story being the mortgage trader there, so kind of causing all the upheaval. Spent next few years, kind of dabbling with startups, started my own company, raised some money, and then running a few operational roles. Ran a large data science product group at Groupon, ran a fashion business unit for them, and then for the last couple of years on the investment side. So I'm with the firm Jump Capital, headquarters Chicago, and then offices New York SF. And we are a slightly later stage fund, more we call expansion stage, Series B investors investing $5 to $15 million check. I invest specifically, focus on enterprise infrastructure, software security. That includes, general industrial internet technologies, your fundamental base architecture, data analytics platforms, DevOps, and so forth. So that's kind of the kind of focus, and we're also we have a sort of thematic eye on the mid of the country. We generally do invest location agnostically, but we try to find a lot of stuff within the U.S. And glad to be here and glad to be talking to you guys.
Great. So, any questions? Well, I think, because this is a big data business analytics conference, and you guys are out there talking to a number of companies, what do you see happening? I mean, we've talked here about the explosion in data, the explosion in tools, and there are all kinds of startups. What's on the bleeding edge right now when it comes to big data and analytics?
Who wants to start?
Companies that can actually help me answer a problem that I have. One of the things that I've seen is there's lots of companies that can do data visualizations and fancy charts and things like that, or find really interesting insights. But for me as a corporate, which will be maybe different than the feedback that my colleagues will give, I need you to be able to solve my problem, not give me interesting technology that I get to go figure out where and how to use. And that has been interesting. Also, GM is a big company. We make cars. The car is our core product. We also have huge supply chains in manufacturing operations, logistic operations, dealers, et cetera. Finding companies that can support the business outside of my core is probably a little bit more interesting than if you want to take on OnStar. That's been another interesting one I've seen. People pitching me OnStar.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, have been living for the last couple of years out of this glorious age of data. This is, and it hasn't started a couple of years ago. This is just a phenomenal time from any data-specific companies and then data-specific vendors or startups kind of going in that world. Having said that, this is also the time when we were sort of in this low capital environment, which kind of meant very easy to start companies, which means now we have a plethora of companies in the space. And so from the perspective of where we go on from here, going forward, I would say a lot of interesting patterns, right? We all hear about artificial intelligence every day long, all driven by, data, compute, algo. Just a unique time of combination of these three things where it makes it somewhat more realistic than it had been throughout in the past history. That we also live in a time where, the data basically can be actually applied from a volume, variety, and velocity perspective to actual use cases. And those to me sort of is the right places for the companies to be spending time on to find the right patterns. So, using that example, kind of leveraging the new sort of algorithmic automation aspects built on top of all the data infrastructure they built for the last, I would say, 7 to 8 years is probably, the next generation focus for many companies and should be. I would say the second big piece, which is, kind of gets lost in this sea of data is, I think, sort of data governance as part of the companies is going to become extremely important. Because now you have so much data, it's every single thing is spitting out data. You're going to reach a point, companies are reaching a point where they can't figure out the data quality issues, the data audit issues, and as for large companies, the compliance piece of, well, once you do 5 transformations of any source of data to a final outcome, how do I go and figure out the track of all that to find out what was the original source? Because some issue happens, you need to go back to the original source. So that data governance, data collaboration pieces within the big data space is just phenomenally interesting to me. And then I would say finally, the piece that I mentioned was collaborative analytics, and as part of that. I mean, we're building individual silos, but it's a pretty interesting piece where how do you do data discovery in this, again, sea of data. Every company like GM would probably have 100 business units. Everyone build their own analytics stack, and that's it. And then after a certain point, half of the company is probably repeating half of those tasks, unknowing the same analytical outcomes probably exist somewhere else, and you can unearth them nicely. So I would say that's probably the third sort of interesting bleeding pieces that should be focused on.
And so that's consistent with my mindset. One other extension to that is contextualization. So in the industrial environment, it's as dirty a data environment as you're going to find, right? Very hard to rationalize different data sources against each other and within a sort of an ecosystem, right? And so systems and companies that can provide a much cleaner view of that data through contextualization is of real value. As a base level offering, right? And then using that foundation to provide domain expertise to actually drive to the end result that Allison wants. So when we look at stuff, we want to be able to say, is that an end-to-end solution for a customer? When we look at companies, when we're trying to find product market fit, right, at our Series A stage, our first calls are to GM and GE and folks that are going to actually buy it. To say, are you deriving value from this? Would you derive value from this, right? And so it actually all does come back to many of the big corporations that say, okay, I want to buy this from a very early stage company because they're solving a problem that I can't solve.
So we get back to business then, huh? That's been a theme that's also popped up here, is not even just getting back to it, but starting from it. And so one of the questions I have, you noted that GM is a fairly large company. How do people find out what it is that you need, what problems you have to solve?
Track down my GM Ventures colleagues. No. So specifically within the data space, GM has its IT in-house. So we have a lot of people, which is an opportunity as well as a challenge. But within that, we actually do have an innovation team that's trying to keep track of what's going on and be able to communicate some of the challenges and things that we're seeing. And from that perspective, being able to attend events not only like this, but also if there is an industry that you're interested in, attending their events, because they will have challenges that they'll be talking about, and there will be panel discussions where you can start to pick up the context of what types of challenges they're having, and thinking through what type of business they do, and thus where their pain points around data might be. For us, quality is actually a really unique challenge, because quality pulls not only on what we did when we designed the vehicle, it comes down to what happened in the plant, what happened at the dealership, and what happened at our customer's home. And who knows? Trying to connect those 4 data sets is really hard. And from that perspective, you could probably get that going to a quality conference as they start to talk through how they're trying to get better at tracking. And you can get insights without having to find like the perfect person at the company, because they don't always exist, but you can start to pick up a lot.
Well, it sounds as if you have some help, though, with some of the venture capitalists as far as they know to call you, which I find is interesting. So that leads to
We
the
talk a
question.
lot.
Well, just by the way you guys greeted each other, you could tell. Who else do you go to?
So, in addition to the venture funds at the corporates, we also have a number of contacts in the BUs and the business units, right, throughout these organizations, right? We will also have, a fairly vast network of thought leaders in certain specific industries, right? So if an energy industry, there are, consultants, there are faculty that understand what that market needs, what the industry needs, and we'll reach out to those folks as well. But, we, as a fund, we pride ourselves on the corporate network that we have in our various investment themes. We have 4 investment themes, and they're very, very focused and dense.
Yeah, I would say it's pretty consistent. I mean, cooperative teams, the ventures teams, end of the day, I mean, we're in the business of investing and then at some point, selling these companies. So, it's pretty smart to start from what the companies want to buy. So those are probably the right places to start for any, no matter what startup. I would say, in some cases, especially if you're investing into B2B businesses, those businesses have further customers on their end. So it's always sort of good to keep tab on what are they buying for, what are they going to do with it, and who they're going to sell it eventually. And I think that also kind of educates you sometimes that some companies are going to buy some stuff because they are going to be catching up on trends which they need to serve as the market is moving that way. I think autonomous vehicles is a good example. There's a consumer orientation moving towards that way, and then so if I'm a OEM or a autonomous security guy building a startup, I want to talk to GM, but I also keeping a tap on how the consumers are consuming that piece, and that's probably another way of sort of keeping a tap on sort of the market.
Well, listening to you, I'm wondering what Wayne State University might do. We've got our new Master of Science and Data Science program launching.
It's a great start.
And yes, we're looking to help train graduate students to be data scientists, but I suspect that it would be nice to also have some of those students look at spinning off their own companies. And we have the Anderson Venture Institute, which I would hope we end up with relationships, if we don't already have them, with you guys to see how we might nurture and get things going. Have you got any suggestions there?
Yeah, I think university in general are probably one of the best places to sort of combine those two things together with the engineering, the analytics, and then some business aspects, which is through the venture centers. I think just because everyone is in that mode of supporting the students and the entrepreneurs, and then is the right place for them to find partners. As a venture fund, I mean, I think, we do a bunch of stuff at our own level. We have done a bunch of partnerships with the UIUC, Urbana-Champaign, which is in our neighborhood in Chicago, and we do a bunch of stuff. We have built our own facility. We do a lot of R&D as part of that, which is a great way to bring the students and then pair up them with our portfolio companies to give them very early exposure to what it is to work in a startup or start something else up. So the point when they are probably reaching graduation points, and maybe even before that, they're not figuring it out just from the brand new way what is to do a startup. They also get to chance to sort of work with some interesting infrastructure. So I think we kind of do that anyways. And I would say, from a local community perspective, I think that's, venture guys connecting the student community to the entrepreneur to a portfolio companies is probably a pretty good way to start.
Yeah, just to be very prescriptive. I'm sure you have some capstone classes in this, right, where you could engage with both big corporates like GM and our portfolio companies to ask for problem statements, right, on a data analytics perspective, and you have those problem statements that they're working on solving those throughout the semester.
You just hit something that I hope Babu, I'm sure, is here. We have, as part of the data science master's program, the idea that we do a set of projects at the end, and right now we're looking at maybe about 6 after the end of the first first set of graduates, splitting them across when we look for proposals from companies that want problems solved, splitting them across large companies and small startups sounds like a very good idea from what you're telling me.
And I would also say don't hesitate to access the other resources at the university. And in addition to entrepreneurship, there's a great medical education system. There's a great engineering education system. So you have industry experts at the students' disposal and trying to be cross-functional about it, because that's one of the beauties of data science is it's really pulling a lot of different insights together and teaching the students even to do that themselves within kind of the safety of the confines of the university will help them to be effective if they come to a corporation or if they're working at a startup and being resourceful.
Totally. I mean, we found some bioinformatics folks that are amazing in our industrial environment, right? They can adapt their skill sets over to the industrial world.
Well, what we're looking to do with the ecosystem is have a core that can support a number of different branches of big data and the various types of analytics that vary widely from the folks doing bio research to those that are looking at improving systems performance, for example. So,
yeah, I think one very specific way where, especially startups around analytics, I think can leverage universities and then universities' partnership with the corporates is actually access to data. Because to be able to build something, especially in the analytics space, you can build a lot of infrastructure, but then to be able to then test the efficacy of the predictive aspects of these things, you just need data. Universities have some sort of their own data, which obviously they're doing for different pieces, but then the corporates can provide, empower them with that, because that's just generally a constraint in kind of building a startup, and that's especially relevant to analytics space.
It's a very good point. Corporates are really mean about sharing their data. So I would say leveraging, even if it's research tests that may not immediately seem like it's useful data, that will be much quicker and easier to get your hands on than trying to come and ask me to go get an agreement. And if it's got to be 3 different groups, some corporates are better than others. Mine is a little bit slow.
well, I was going to say we're well aware of the problems, but I didn't want to point out saying GM's a problem. This shows up particularly in healthcare. Folks are and it also shows up on industry. People are very concerned about their intellectual property. We understand that. And yes, we've managed to work out a number of agreements right down to, here's our security plan. these are the only 2 people who will touch your data. It will be stored here. So yeah, but that does take a lot more time to work out and have people feel comfortable. I wonder if we can switch just a bit. We kind of hit on this, but okay, for those here who have no idea how this works and how a company progresses from its first request for money. I mean, Jim Anderson talked yesterday, and he said he took $1,000 of his own and never had to borrow any. Not everyone is that fortunate, and so what's the typical path for starting a company, getting initial funding, getting your second round, and moving forward?
I'll take the early part and I'll hand off. So at the very early stage, the sort of we call pre-seed stage, oftentimes you're taking founder money, like Jim did, and you're not paying yourself, and you're working on establishing your MVP, your minimum viable product, that you can then hopefully sell, or perhaps just start to get your customer base to use to get feedback from. And then that feedback can oftentimes get you to raise a few $100,000 of outside capital. Usually it's less than $1 million. In this market, it's in the neighborhood of 250 to 500. That usually also is in what's called a convertible note, which is basically, it's what it sounds like. It's a note. It's a debt instrument that will, you hope, turn into equity once what's called a priced round comes in. People like me come in and set it on the cap table on the equity side of the business. You're able to use that early money to go and establish a few customers that you can start driving some revenue. That can then trigger a seed round, which is that equity round. That seed round is in the neighborhood of low-end $1 million, high-end 2.5, again, in this general market. And then you get to a point that you're doing maybe a few $100,000 in revenue. And by the way, this is all in the world of the business-to-business SaaS, which is what I think most of you guys be focused on anyway. Then we get involved, as I mentioned, at a company doing maybe $500,000 or so in revenue, and then we go and make that investment, of 3 to 5, and then help that company with syndicate partners to get to a revenue rate that is. What do you like to see, Saurabh, for a Series B generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think at Series B, I mean, depending on the product, I think the starting point is you've got to be around 3 million plus run rate. That's kind of, we would like to see product market fit proven. You're kind of reaching that 3 million plus, and then you're literally looking for, hey, now I want to go scale this company. You have really good visibility on that, and we come in to help you scale from that point to be a $20 million run rate business. At that point, you probably go raise a growth equity round.
I'm going to ask you guys to clarify for the audience. A $20 million run rate, how many customers? This is going to be average, but I imagine a lot of these people are like 20 million seems abstract. What does that mean in terms of growing people that are using the product?
So unfortunately, it's actually it's a different number for different companies. So we have companies that have $20 million run rate that have four customers, because they have massive land and expand. Land and expand, you land a contract, you expand it dramatically. They have heavy business development teams that do that, right? There's a company down in Chicago called Uptake that Saurabh knows well, that they have probably 4 customers.
Maybe,
and they are at a
$100
million run rate, right? So on the flip side, we have companies in our portfolio that are at a $5 million run rate that have 80 customers, because their price point is very low, right? And so there is a pretty dramatic difference, even in the world of B2B SaaS.
And so those are the types of things when you're in pre-seed and maybe using some of your own money that you want to start to figure out. A lot of the investment rounds are driven by business milestones. They will be coordinated with technical milestones. But generally, it's business driven. It's how many customers are you getting? Do people like your product? Will people pay for your product? To go back, in the really early stage, there are resources. If your friends and family aren't, super rich, to get that 250 to 500,000, there's a Michigan Angels Fund. Invest Detroit has a new fund, and so there are resources. If you have a great idea and people have started to show interest, don't hesitate to start to exploring the network here in Michigan. There are resources to help you take that from an idea to sort of first discussions and MVP.
I would say, though, that very few outside entities are investing in ideas right now. Most are going to ask you, including the First Capital Fund that Allison mentioned out of Invest Detroit, are going to ask you to build something. We're not doing that. You don't see. We used to see a lot more idea investment. We don't see as much right now.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, obviously the companies, by the time they come to our stage, they've kind of, figured out the game.
Better have more than
playing. That. They know, what they need to do to kind of reach the point. I think tactically, where it's sort of most valuable for everyone here is, how to get to the point, even the initial point. I would preface that saying that, the time we're living in, it is extremely cheap to start a business today, right? To start, and it costs money to scale. But this is, it does not cost a lot of money to start a business. In my opinion, in a sort of enterprise B2B analytics kind of a space, the first point before you do anything is maybe raise a little bit from friends and family to find yourself a pilot customer. That should be your first tactical point. You build a product, and you don't need to build a full product. You build a working prototype in your lab, getting guidance from the Business Entrepreneurship Center and Engineering Center. Build a working prototype that you believe is solving a problem, and then you go find a sample customer for yourself who's going to give you a trial. You have that sample customer, you get his feedback, you're going to get your pre-seed money based on that one or two customers. And then you just keep replicating the process. And that's as tactical that you can scale that piece.
Well, I could ask you guys how people find those first customers, but I want to flip that and say we've got a number of companies here. So they're approached by a startup. How should they feel, and what should they be looking for when they turn around and hire that startup that you bring to them? Say, oh, he's got this great solution that'll do blah, blah, blah. I'm sure there's going to be some trepidation. What do you mean I'm your first customer? Now, we're not talking heart surgery here, hopefully, so, and might it be, look, we'll let you play with our data, but we're not paying you? I mean, what should they be looking for?
I want to hear what Allison has to say first. 'Cause this is a big issue, right? So.
Ooh. So specifically on the corporation that I work for, there are different departments with different levels of flexibility and capability. In the data space, we don't have a big R&D arm, so it's not something where my R&D guys can do a little project with a company and kind of see how things work. If you were to bring me a battery chemical, we might ask for one sample, and I've got people in a lab that can pick it apart and test it to the ends of the world. But specifically for data, I am a tough customer. Trying to get the data sets out, let alone pay you for doing some sort of analyst, it's just not, I don't think I'm worth your while.
So this is an effort that a number of big companies are working on right now. They have arms of divisions that are trying to work with outside companies and trying to reform their processes to work with small companies that can't handle the weight of working with a GM or a GE or you name it, right? And so what we've seen from big data perspective is when a big corporate has a data set, just on a historian, that they can dump over to the startup, that can be used for the startup to actually demonstrate, modeling, analytics, whatever it might be. That's been the most seamless path and the fastest way for a product to show some value without trying to go and get a bunch of contract revenue, which takes a lot because you have your master service agreements, things like that, and you're not, well, probably most importantly, you're not asking the big company to integrate with the startup from a data perspective, from a connectivity perspective. You're just saying, here's a data dump, go work on it, come back to me.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, I think it's extremely hard, with few exceptions, of course, to get a large corporate to sort of do some trial run with you, unless you have a friend like Allison who can really introduce you internally. I think that might happen, but it's as you said, they're not taking bets. More importantly, they don't have time, and this is just not their priority. There's so much internal priorities. Your best bet is to find mid to small size customer, a potential customer, and then you might have to do the first trial run for free, for sure. You give a paid trial, nothing to lose offer, because this is your chance to sort of prove it out. In fact, you need the feedback, and then secondly, the testimonial is probably the most value to you at this point when you're starting to build this company and go raise some money than actually any revenue from them. So you need those 2 points. So you got to find a champion, in those 2 places. Go talk to other startups who reached a slightly larger stage. They are the most prone to probably giving you a test. They just went to the stage and they kind of went the other side. And at least all the companies, or at least the early stage companies I advise, I link them to either my portfolio companies or some other companies at a later stage, and they would test them out. They're getting free service. I was running a marketing team, and I tested every single marketing vendor free of cost all the time because I was getting for free, and I understood that these guys are trying to get it. And I think that my experience has worked out much better.
Well, all right, we talked about data analytics here, and you guys have to make decisions of whether to invest or not. Do you use analytics to determine whether or not you should invest in somebody, or just gut feeling?
Well, it's not gut feeling. We don't certainly use analytics, and I think in this sort of world, we use some very simple math, right? Our very simple math is we're trying to own a certain amount of a company. We usually target around 20% of a company for a certain amount of money. And with that, we try to set that up such that when we sell the company, we can return, a meaningful amount to our fund. From looking at it from the outside of if we should invest, if this is a right fit for us, that's much more a qualitative exercise where we have specific insight into an industry, for me, in the intelligent manufacturing world, and we're seeing something unique in this company relative to its competition and needs of its customers. So much more qualitative for us at the Series A.
For me, it is like getting the planets to align. So I would say there's no analytics. Canvassing for any startup externally, and then canvassing the internal business groups within General Motors, and trying to find not only alignment and interest, but actually helping to move those relationships to project stage. We do similar work in terms of understanding ownership, what's the market size, to help check valuation and things like that. But at the end of the day, the hardest part of my job is actually getting 2 groups aligned and getting like a pilot or concept project kicked off.
Yeah, I mean, as Adrian said, I think it would be unfair to sort of characterize any analysis we do for finding companies to call it analytics. I think there's a process to it. There is obviously a lot of judgment to it, experience to it. I think we do obviously rely on tons of analytical tools which are available, which again, interesting discovery tools I would call it, which are available. I mean, there are tools like Mattermark, there are tools like PitchBook, which basically aggregate all the data around the companies, their information, the stage, the employees. They track trends. on them. They track the employee growth. They track the momentum for consumer companies. More importantly, they track all the social media coverage for those companies. And I think all those as a combination is analytics, and those are signals. I mean, at the end of the day, that's about you're trying to find more and more signals. There are, I've attempted to build something which more, collect tons of data points from publicly available pieces. But for the most part, I think you rely on these analytical tools to make some judgment calls, and then obviously do your analysis on the product and the company and the team.
Now, those funds are out there. There's a fund called Correlation Ventures out of San Diego, and they are 100% an analytics venture fund. So they take in data, they don't meet the company, they get their deal flow from investors like Saurabh and I, and they look at all the information, the term sheet, what the company's doing, the people in play, and they make a decision within 2 weeks, and they make an investment, and they have been very successful.
We call them the index funds of the venture capital world.
Well, I don't know what the stats are, but I've seen that, the startup companies, what's the percentage of them that make it?
Very low.
Very low. So that means somebody invested money someplace that they didn't get back.
Mm-hmm.
So it would seem that, well, once you've given them money, I suppose you'd want to see before you give them more. But I would think that analytics might help as far as looking and saying, maybe the next time we don't give a company like this cash.
So, our data set is pretty small, right? Our portfolio for every fund that we raise is in the neighborhood of 12 to 14 companies, right? In a number of different sectors, right? And so, it's hard to build a big data set, kind of a big model on that.
Well, you need to get data from someplace else.
Yeah,
then,
yeah.
right? That we're back to.
But
Yeah.
you don't have the insight of the other thing, and that's why the difference is that public data versus sort of private, right?
Yeah, Patrick, I would say, venture, the reason it's venture is because it's an early stage game, right? And at early stage, the qualitative signals, the betting on the team, the maturity of the team, the understanding of the market and the product, the quality of the product are so much more sort of subjective and qualitative to be able to build analytical models and things like that. I can probably get all that data, which is data like every single company that has been funded in the last 10 years for every stage, for every product, for every industry sector. And I would say any kind of prediction there for the early stage of the life cycle of the company would be noise, having probably and done this and tried to do this. As these companies start reaching a point where they are in that 20 million plus revenue ranges, right? And then you can start basically looking at tons of operational information hidden on those numbers, and that's no different than when they're publicly available, and then you can just go how they're running the business, because at that point it's about scaling that business and then operationally effectively operating the business, and those things are all from a sector perspective and all that are easily indexable and analyzable.
Well, great. I said that we would take some time to take questions from you all who've been sitting out there patiently. Do we have some questions? And if so, I will wander out with the microphone and see if others can hear what your question is. So, any hands? Yes, we have one over here. See if the knees still work. There we are.
Thank you very much for the insights. So I had a question for you. You were talking about the stages of starting up and getting to the seed thing. The only thing that was missing that I thought maybe if you could just give a little insight on is the timing, like the time frame involved.
Sure. So it varies dramatically, and it varies depending on the kind of company. So in the world of big data, so software, the times are actually much shorter than in batteries, which is the time is really, really long, right? Or biotech, right? For example. But in this world, We tend to see companies at that pre-seed stage when they're just building their first product to take, in the neighborhood of a year or two to sort of, lock up that first customer, right? Whether it may be paid or not. But it takes a good 18 to 24 months at times to build that, to iterate, to see that the first couple iterations didn't work, they didn't fit, that wasn't what the customer wanted, and then in that sort of 24-month neighborhood, you might get to a point where you raise that first round that I mentioned of the few $100,000, right? And then there are some companies that really hit it and can begin to raise that seed round within a year. Others, again, take a couple years in between rounds. If you're getting into 3 to 4 years in this world, then you probably missed your mark, and it may be time to retool to something else. And then you kind of go. But you see that sort of, we tend to see these 18 to 24 month cycles between a lot of these rounds.
So my question is a little bit more to get to know the panel. So out of the projects or companies that you have worked on, what was your favorite? And if you don't want to get into those details, maybe what's your favorite part of the whole process of your jobs?
Well, I mean, everything I've invested in, all of them are pretty equally dear to me, and they're very early in the life cycle for me to start picking or choosing between them to say, hey, I like this more.
Nobody will tell.
That's right. I would
Pick
say
a favorite kid.
Yeah, publicly, that's right. On video, apparently, can't do that. But I would say the favorite part of the process is literally, and I think it's going to probably remain that way forever, the meeting the entrepreneur, because, I think the passion there, having been on that seat, both running an early stage and then being an operator, I think, every time you're here, and if you've done this before, you feel like you should be out in the game doing it again, because the person is super passionate, obviously thinks he's going to own the world no matter what sector he is. He's probably the Zuckerberg of the world. And I think that feeling and kind of engaging into that, challenging him on that, and then seeing him, especially the good ones, come and retort back and holding their ground, with obviously a very critical meeting, because I'm trying to really tear him down, maybe find reasons mostly meetings find reasons not to invest, and then finally finding him reasons not to value him too highly where he is. Every time, all the pushback that he gives to tell that how his story is the best and he's going to own the world. I think that's just a phenomenal part of the process.
I love kind of growing on that, working with entrepreneurs, especially in the venture space. A lot of times they're imagining what the future world will be, and you become a partner with them to get there. And so especially with the corporate, it's kind of interesting. I ended up focused in automotive, but I looked at things from autonomous to speech rec to industrial automation, and that getting to see the breadth of cutting edge on everything and kind of feeling like you have a front seat ride on multiple roller coasters, as long as you like adrenaline, it's awesome.
So, and I think this is because I'm an entrepreneur at heart. My favorite part is post-investment, working with the companies and helping to drive new strategic efforts, products, whatever it might be. Like, I love more than anything, working with the teams, not just the CEOs. I work with the entire team of our companies, right? And so whenever I, am meeting with an entrepreneur and we kind of really vibing and feel like this is an interesting fit, what I tell them is like, look, I have one sort of major goal, right? If we end up working together, like, I want to be the first person you call when shit goes wrong. Right, that's what I want to be to you, right? And that's what I strive for, right? I haven't succeeded in my relationship with our CEOs until I'm that person, right? Because it's easy to get the call when things are great, but when things are bad, I got to know soon so I can help you fix it.
That's why you want investors like these guys. Not everyone appreciates actually going along on the art of the journey with the entrepreneur. For some of them, it's all the thrill of the chase, and then you're kind of left back. But finding guys like these is excellent.
Hi. We kind of touched on data starting to become a barrier of entry for startups. I was hoping you guys could kind of build on top of that, and more specifically, if you build a platform and you're able to cheaply build an MVP, but you can't really scale and you can't really charge for that application until you purchase data to really validate your models and really get your application to that level. At what point should a startup look into purchasing large data sets to really test their products out? And especially like a lot today, we've been hearing about companies needing to use external data to solve their problems. And if you want to be a startup that kind of brings multiple data sets together, if a startup comes up to you for like a seed round funding and asks for $500,000 but says, we need $250,000 to go purchase data, are you going to go look at them like they're crazy? Or at what point should they look at like buying those premium data sets?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you are building a business which basically is in the application of unearthing certain patterns with a specific kind of data, by definition, if you build a product around it, you probably have done that analysis on some kind of data, because else you don't know you have a business. I mean, you're building you're let's say a predictive company, and you don't know that you're predictive unless you've done that test on certain set of data. So my presumption there is that you probably already have access to some data which is statistically valid for you to prove to yourself that you have a company and an idea here that you're going to go pursue. And I think that's a good starting point as well. I mean, you're not. I wouldn't advise you as a first step to go and buy any expensive form of data as an outside data as your first investment. You got to find a customer, and you probably convince him that, listen, here is my outcome based on whatever I could gather from there. This is valid, this is statistically significant, and then let him sponsor that data for you. And he can own that data as long as you build an application on top of that, and then now you have a second step, and then you go from there. And I think that's kind of you solve for the barrier, especially in that particular use case.
We are towards the end here. I'm getting the signal from Babu back there that it's time for us to wrap up. Thank our panel. I hope you all enjoyed this. And if you did, please show that with a round of applause for our panelists.